What's up, everyone? My name is Paul Schulz, and you're listening to
Talking Taboo. I'm Portia Baudisch.
I'm Joshi.
Today we're here with Professor George Gonzalez at the University of Miami, Dr. George Gonzalez, who is an author of multiple books about politics and the environment, and he has a book coming out in March called The Energy, the Modern State, and the American World System. So watch out for it. Today we're going to talk about the environment and a little bit of stuff that even if you consider yourself an environmentally conscious person, you might have never known before. So we'll jump right into it. This semester I'm taking a class with Dr. George Gonzalez, and he has talked about the effect of urban sprawl. And so urban sprawl means, if you've ever noticed, we live in these low-density neighborhoods and communities. Our houses are far away from our jobs, and our houses are far away from our shops and our friends, and obviously this leads to driving a lot. And some of us might think recycling or finding cleaner energy is the solution to climate change and to really the US's contribution to climate change. But Dr. George Gonzalez, he offers the idea that maybe it's urban sprawl. So if you want to take it away and give us a little bit about that.
Yeah. The argument that I've been making in my academic literature, most pronouncedly beginning in 2009 with my book Urban Sprawl, Global Warming, and the Empire of Capital, is on the one hand, what I document and argue is that as an economic stimulus, what the United States has used most consistently to stimulate and grow the economy is urban sprawl. What urban sprawl does, it creates primarily demand for consumer durables. Consumer durables are items that are expected to last at least 3 years. So most glaringly the automobile, but furniture, electronics, televisions, computers, right? These items are expected to last at least 3 years, and they were the mainstay, and they were the mainstay of the American industrial base beginning. Well, we can see this in the 1930s. It was quite clear, and they're now the mainstay of the broader global economy. And so urban sprawl, again, became a strategy that was embedded in the state in the 1930s in order to spur the consumption specifically and most obviously of automobiles, but again, of a whole sector of consumer durables. And this was the way to resuscitate the American economy from the Great Depression. And so this stimulus strategy maintains to this day. I think it's a little known, little understood fact that urban sprawl is the prime stimulus strategy of the American state. It has been so, again, very clearly from the 1930s until today. So from an economic point of view, urban sprawl creates stability, it creates industrial employment, it creates economic opportunities. But what we now understood quite clearly is that it also carries a very profound liability of global warming. Because urban sprawl creates, quite clearly, a very energy ineffective, a very energy profligate transportation infrastructure. It also creates a very energy ineffective, again, energy profligate housing structure. Because what urban sprawl does, in order for it to work, it requires large sums of energy. To commute, like Portia said, to drive everywhere. We have these relatively large abodes, which we, here in South Florida, right, we have to use all this electricity to cool it. In northern regions, not only do you cool these large abodes during the summertime, but you have to heat them in the wintertime. So what we now understand is that urban sprawl has historically been one of the key drivers. Urban sprawl in the United States has been one of the key drivers of the global warming phenomenon.
Now, let me interrupt you really quick. In terms of urban sprawl, the first thing I think is big houses that take up a lot of space. Do you think that has anything to do with the perfect American dream and the culture, and that everyone has almost a right to like...
I'm gonna interrupt you here.
Interrupt.
I think, and this is from my class and just my own personal opinion, that American dream is constructed by our government and by the people that own these corporations that want us to be buying these things and wanting these huge houses and all these, and be these, wealthy and independent people, but with, in a neighborhood and down the block at the cul-de-sac. And I think that, if people, my question is, if people know, if it's understood by some that urban sprawl is harmful and leads to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, why aren't we changing?
Well, one factor, so there's this cultural argument, right, which Paul raises. And yes, there is this argument that for Americans, abundance equals freedom. But what I would, but Portia is also correct. I think there's also the fact that, right, what's presented to us by the media elite, what's presented to us by our political elites, right, is that this is the concept of freedom, right? The ability to own the big house, the ability to drive the SUV. I mean, what I like to stress, and I do this more so in my classes because this is much more of a sociological or psychological critique, is that urban sprawl carries a substantial amount of social and psychological costs. So first and foremost, most obviously, look at all the commuting time that we spend driving just to and from work, right? You know, people spend an hour, 2 hours a day, 1 hour commuting to work, 1 hour commuting home. And indeed, studies have shown that the more time we spend commuting in our cars, actually our health deteriorates as a result. So it takes an impact, it takes a negative impact in terms of our family time, right? Our recreational time because we're spent driving, but it also takes an impact on our health.
Why is that?
Well, I don't know. See, you know, this is something that, again, I've read in the literature. You know, my focus here is not psychology or public health, but I just know in terms of public health what the literature says on that. You know, I can just imagine, right? I know I hate commuting, and you know, just the stress of driving and the idea that, wow, I could be home, but I'm spending with my wife and daughter.
My butt always falls asleep.
Right.
I'm driving for such a long time, and that hurts me.
Well, outside of just like the sociological effects of urban sprawl, when you talk, I know, like from your books, I've understood that urban sprawl, it has stimulated our economy, but it has all these detrimental effects on the environment. My question is, when you first talk about urban sprawl being our dominant policy in the 1930s, do you think it was simply an ignorance of the environment, or do you think it was a malicious attempt to say, screw the environment, it's time for monetization of our resources?
Right. Well, I mean, you know, there's always been that sort of screw your environment attitude, okay? Because even if we didn't understand global warming, and of course there were pockets of scientists that did, even in the 30s, but more broadly, right, there was an understanding of air pollution, right? So we see air, you know, Los Angeles, I mean, there's a real irony historically because Los Angeles used to be known for its clean air. But Los Angeles was the first, I know we laugh, but Los Angeles, people would retire from places with very dirty air, like from Cincinnati, Cleveland, Chicago, because those areas were major centers of industry that relied very heavily, if not exclusively, on soft bituminous coal, which was very polluting. So people's dreams in, you know, the first couple of decades in the 20th century or the last decade of the 19th century was to amass a fortune in a place like Chicago with this very poor air quality and then retire to a clean air haven like Los Angeles. What happens in Los Angeles is the first major city in the world to predicate its urban transportation on the automobile. So already by the 1940s, we see Los Angeles having extremely poor air quality simply as a result of the automobile, or mostly, almost entirely as a result of the automobile. But yet, you know, there was this commitment. In spite of the air pollution problems that arose from mass automobile use, they remained a commitment to the automobile. Also, of course, we understood intuitively, even, you know, when the oil revolution started, you know, when they first struck oil in 1853 in Titusville, Pennsylvania, right, we always understood this to be a finite resource. So, you know, even going back to the 60s and 70s with the first oil crisis, particularly in the 70s, right, this came very much to the fore about the finite nature of oil and how American cities, because they were predicated on urban sprawl, they are, from an environmental perspective, in terms of an energy supply perspective, irrational. But there's always been like, okay, you know, we're just, in terms of the American political elite, the American economic elite, there's always like, okay, it works now. If there's a problem tomorrow, then we'll confront it then. Right? And so the idea that right now we have a global warming crisis, which is unfurling right before us, well, as the crisis gets more and more pointed, well, then we'll do something then. Of course, the reality is it may very well be too late. But yes, there's always been this attitude in the United States that we see it beginning with the centering on urban sprawl of a sense like, you know, we're just going to worry about today and we're really not going to think about tomorrow in any reasonable, serious sense.
And that is unlike other nations of the world, right? Like countries like Japan, Germany, other like major industrial nations don't have that, you know, instant gratification attitude.
Yes, I mean, certainly, you know, that's true broadly. I would submit that's true broadly, where there's more of a thought, okay, we're thinking about future generations in terms of our investments. We're going to pursue a line of investment. Again, that's going to maybe not pay off immediately, but it'll pay off in the medium to longer term future. There is that thinking. But it's also true, just limiting to the conversation of urban sprawl and oil use and greenhouse gas emissions, it's also true that countries like Japan and Western Europe, they don't don't have much oil domestically, and so they've always dealt, and here we're talking about post-World War II period, they have dealt with their limited energy resources primarily through a system of conservation. So they have historically sought to limit their exposure and their vulnerability to the world oil system because, especially coming out of World War II, the countries of Western Central Europe, country of Japan, didn't have any real influence over the world energy system. So, what I argue in my classes is that what American cities should look like, they should model themselves on Tokyo. They should model themselves on Paris, just by way of example, right? Which these are very livable cities. They have a lot to offer, right? And they're walking cities. And, another aspect that we haven't emphasized here in terms of urban sprawl. Urban sprawl is also very isolating, right? We isolate ourselves from our neighbors. We're sort of walled up in these large homes, right? And, how much contact do we have with people in our very neighborhoods? Where, cities like Paris, like Berlin, like Tokyo, they're more socially oriented cities. It's easier to have contact, to have friends, and so that's just the point is that I would argue that living the quality of life, I would argue, is higher in these other cities around the world as opposed to the United States. So the idea of the big house or the big car, I think that's my view, is that's a chimera. That's empty. The real content of that is isolation, large time spent driving, the health effects of that. So that's another. I think quality of life is actually better in the more reasonably, rationally organized urban zones, where again they're more environmentally friendly, they're more geared towards a community and social fabric.
So
let's say that finally maybe the government will recognize the issues with urban sprawl. How would we even go about changing our communities? Are we going to rip up all the development that we have right now? And how will we even begin to go closer to Paris and Berlin?
Well, the fact is that and I haven't done the research on this, okay? So take this comment in that light. But I would submit, I feel very confident that reorganizing our urban zones to be more environmentally rational, to be more socially rational, would cost us a lot less than seeking to maintain our sprawled urban zones, right? So think of all the money we spent on energy. Think of global warming. Think of the air pollution costs that we incur, right? Think about the loss of biodiversity. Right? And so, think of all the money we spend importing oil, importing energy. Think of all the money we spent on the military to oversee a global energy system that in significant part is meant to maintain urban sprawl in the United States. We spend roughly, $1 trillion a year on the military. Think if we could take just half that, 500 billion of that, and just put it into reorganizing our urban zones. Those cities will be like Oz in terms of their beauty and in terms of all the kind of positive amenities that we would have. So I think our lives would be immeasurably better, as well as our economics in that sense will be immeasurably better.
Do you think that will ever happen in our lifetime, the next lifetime? Like, what would we have to do or do to see that happen?
Well, that's an excellent question. What I would say, and I'm going to argue from the perspective of my research, okay, which is that my view, and what I've argued over a series of books, is that urban sprawl in the United States is a necessary feature, and I'm not exaggerating here, it's a necessary feature of global capitalism. So urban sprawl in the US is a necessary feature of global capitalism. So indicative of this, American consumers, now when I say American consumers, I'm excluding government and I'm excluding businesses here. So simply private consumers in the US consume 20 to 25% of the total global output. So with less than 5% of the world's population, in the US, we consume roughly a fifth to a quarter of all goods and services produced in the world. Okay. And so, the argument is that the reason that Americans consume such a massive sum in terms of goods and services is directly a result of urban sprawl. Right, and so just thinking about it from the automobile industry, in terms of the automobile industry, the American market is by far the most profitable segment of the global automotive market. Why? It's because the SUVs. Well, first and foremost, we consume a lot of automobiles. Given our population, we consume massive amounts of automobiles. But perhaps more importantly, we consume large amounts of light trucks, pickup trucks and SUVs. So there are cars that are sold here in the U.S. that cannot be sold in Europe. They cannot be sold in Japan. Now, I'm not saying there's necessarily government prohibition against selling those kinds of automobiles, but gasoline prices are much higher in those countries solely due to taxation, because again, they're trying to insulate themselves from the world oil market. Moreover, those cities are much more densely organized. So I could just imagine the nightmare of trying to find a parking spot in Paris, driving around an Escalade. It's just, again, it's not something that's very feasible. So in terms of the sheer number of cars we consume and the quality of cars we consume, I could even say, I think somewhat reasonably, it's impossible to imagine the global automotive market without American consumption. And so, in terms of reform, my point is that's what you're running up against, right? Again, sprawl as a necessary stimulus, as almost a structural stimulus to not only the U.S. economy, but to the global economy. So, and this is why the United States has tragically, sadly, resisted any kind of significant move toward the global treaty on climate change. Because any global treaty on climate change, by necessity, is going to have to reform American urban sprawl. But again, to reform American urban sprawl is going to call the global capitalist system into question.
So, what should we do? What can we do?
I mean, what I'm thinking is, like, when does urban sprawl become too much? When will corporations be like, okay, now it's enough?
It'll always be profitable for them.
But will we ever reach a point where urban sprawl is just like, it becomes...
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting you make that point because, and again,
we run out of space, essentially.
Well, I wouldn't say, I don't think the concern is running out of space. I mean, think about this. I mean, in New Jersey, and as in northern New Jersey, they even I used to live there in the late 90s. Even then, there were people that were commuting 2 hours a day plus, right, from their homes in Pennsylvania to Manhattan. Again, this is going back in the 90s. There were people that were commuting 2 hours a day in the San Francisco area. So it seems like, people's tolerance to drive long distances, to really, spend a lot of time driving in order to own a home and to work in the city center. I mean, people, they saw a high level of tolerance, an amazing level of tolerance. So, what people were thinking about as a limitation, and this was on the political agenda in the last decade, was that we had crossed the point of peak oil. So conventional oil production was perceived to be declining downward, right? And even this was, a part of the thinking in terms of American policy towards Iraq, right? To introduce, the invasion of Iraq, what it would have done and has done to a significant degree, it's reintroduced Iraqi oil full throttle into the global oil system. But my point is that one of the modes of thought that prompted that policy was the very real concern that conventional oil production was declining. And so there was a lot of talk and a lot of thinking that the United States was going to finally have to do something about its massive oil consumption, about its massive energy consumption, simply because of natural limits with regards to the supply of oil. And so what set that aside, what has set these concerns aside, is the unconventional fossil fuel revolution. Right? And so, what was not thought possible, and I say this because, again, I was reading the literature, I was following the literature in terms of oil production to the best of my ability. And it was not thought possible that you could get this much oil as we've gotten out of oil shale, right? Or the Canadian oil sands. So right now, again, this idea that, we're just going to push the football down the road. Right now, as we stand here in 2017, the thinking is, we don't have to worry about oil supply right now because we have oil shale, we have Canadian oil sands. So we're not going to worry about urban sprawl. We're not going to worry about oil supply because, again, right now we're fine. Now maybe 10, 20 years from now, we're going to be back in a crisis mode. But right now things are working, again, quote unquote. Even though, we are accelerating in terms of the global warming crisis. It's important to know, and one thing, I made the point on a number of occasions in other venues that, one of the biggest modes of misinformation about global warming is that this is something that future generations are going to have to worry about. That is completely false and untrue. We have to worry about it right now. And I say this because the fossil record shows us that once you hit a tipping point, that global temperature will increase very, very dramatically in a very, very short period of time. So we're not talking about, record temperatures in 2050 or 2070. We're talking about record temperatures in 2020. And we're already seeing one year after another of temperature increase. In other words, one record-breaking year after another. So we may very well be. There's a lot of speculation that we're already in that upward slope where we're going to see global temperatures climb very dramatically.
And no longer linearly, but exponentially.
Exponentially going upward, yes. No longer a linear increase, but yes, thank you. Yes, an exponential increase in terms of global temperature, an exponential collapse of the Greenland ice sheets, an exponential collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet, an exponential increase in the release of methane from the northern climes. So again, this idea where political elites or media elites will say, well, let's address the climate change problem because we don't want to burden our grandchildren with this. That is, whether by intent or otherwise, that's misinformation. Right. We're confronting global warming this very second and moment. I mean, I'll even mention the case of North Korea. And we know, of course, that North Korea has, I was just reading this article today, an editorial about the hunger problems that North Korea has. And part of the reason that North Korea does have its problems with hunger, not only is it an embargo system, which is very pronounced, but it's also the fact that they have had a number of droughts and a number of floods which have compromised their food supply. And this can be directly linked with global warming. So the point is that you're looking at a country like North Korea, that may very well be the canary in the minefield, right? So we can expect to see more of this going forward.
I want to mention that you make this case in your book, American Empire and the Canadian Oil Sands. So I feel like many Americans might feel that the federal government is trying to combat climate change and is trying to work on new technologies that might help prolong or lessen the impact that we're making on the world, but really, that's not the case. With our relationship with the Canadian oil sands, with our pipelines, enhancing them, and all the things that are really going on behind closed doors, there seems to be almost a facade that the federal government is doing more than they really are. Can you just talk about that and how we can go about exposing it if we can?
Right, that's a very good question, Portia. Thank you for bringing that up. In terms of American policies, American government policies, and specifically focusing on the federal level, but in the states and localities are also to one degree or another complicit in this, I would submit, is that they are very pro-fossil fuels. And they promote the use of fossil fuels. And we see this very clearly with the unconventional fossil fuel revolution, right? Because it was the unconventional fossil fuel revolution tapping into specifically and most clearly gas shale and oil shale. That is a direct function and product of federal policy. Right. So it is the American government that fostered the technology to hydrofrack. It was the American government which went out and identified the very substantial oil and gas shale formations around the country. And so with that, the American state, broadly conceived, is deepening America's addiction to fossil fuels. And I say this in significant part because, right, when you make gas, natural gas less expensive, when you make oil less expensive, what this does is serves as a barrier to wind and solar. And perhaps most tragically, this is not only the case here in the United States, but the unconventional fossil fuel revolution is deepening the world's commitment to fossil fuels. So what we see happening is Germany now they're making a real push towards wind and solar. I would submit they're doing so predominantly as a strategy of energy independence. But it's important to note that Germany has found itself at a competitive disadvantage with the U.S. because Germany energy costs are higher than the U.S. So we see reports of Germany losing investment opportunities to the U.S. because the U.S. again is deepening its commitment to fossil fuels, is bringing lots of fossil fuels to market and giving it a competitive advantage over Germany in particular. And in that way, America is directly, quite clearly undermining the clean renewables experiment or the push by clean renewables by Germany. And moreover, the United States now is exporting. So there's so much. I mean, it's an amazing turnaround because just 12 years ago, the United States was talking about the need to import large amounts of liquefied natural gas. And think about the turnaround that today we're actually exporting large amounts of liquefied natural gas. So again, it's not a hyperbole, it's not an exaggeration to talk about the unconventional fossil fuels revolution. But the point here is that by exporting natural gas, what the United States is doing is driving down the cost of fossil fuels globally, again, undermining any pushes towards clean renewables like solar, like wind or wave power, etc.
Now, for the most part, Portia and I were talking about before you came in how the public has this idea that by recycling and reusing, that in itself will dramatically change global warming. But it's obvious that urban sprawl and the use of fossil fuels have such dramatic effects that recycling and reusing aren't enough to combat those things. So how do you get the general American population to understand that there are other facets that have to be tackled besides just recycling and renewing?
Well, I mean, I'm not even sure really, it's not even clear to me how recycling
and renewing have
any kind of material impact in terms of climate change. I mean, what I would say is that, what I will simply point out is that this year, again, this is reflective, I think, of what Portia was indicating, that, now the Trump administration, they are pro-fossil fuels. As far as I can gather, I think quite reasonably, they're actually pro-global warming. I mean, the effect of their policy and rhetoric is to be pro-global warming. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that the Trump administration, consciously or not, is actually seeking to warm the planet.
Right.
I mean, quite tragically, quite upsetting. But going back to the Obama administration, let's just say, to talk about, we're going to do something about climate change. We're going to somehow, again, and Portia was indicating this, that this is just rhetoric, because the Obama administration, more than any other administration, right, can be implicated in terms of the global warming phenomenon because it oversaw the unconventional fossil fuels revolution, right? I mean, just by way of contrast, interestingly, France, which is thought to have the most promising gas and oil shale formations in Europe, has prohibited hydrofracking in that country, right? So entirely, they do not allow hydrofracking. They do not allow exploration. They've actually passed laws prohibiting hydrofracking, right? So why didn't the U.S. do the same, right? The U.S. should have done the same, but instead, again, for reasons that maybe are somewhat outside the scope of this conversation, and maybe we'll revisit, some of the again, why the Obama administration committed the country to the hydrofracking revolution. Again, maybe we can't have some time for that. But the point is that the Obama administration deepened our commitment to fossil fuels, and a direct result of this is that 2017 is a record year in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. Right. Mm-hmm. So, we have, the scientific community has acknowledged global warming. There's total unity in the scientific community about global warming. We're seeing the realities of global warming everywhere. We're seeing our natural systems basically become destabilized, but yet our emissions are increasing. Right. And so that's what we need to focus our mind on. Right. Set aside rhetoric, set aside, the supposedly easy paths. The reality is that our emissions are going up. And again, we are day by day in a profound, critical, catastrophic way, destabilizing the global biosphere.
Now, you mentioned that France entirely stopped hydrofracking.
They never started it.
And never started
Never allowed it.
I feel like in the U.S., we feel that if we did stop hydrofracking, that would negatively impact us. How is France
at least
coping?
Economically?
Right. How is France coping without the need to?
Well, I mean, the fact is that, again, I made mention of this before, which was that the countries of Europe, the NATO allies in Europe, Japan, right, they never embraced urban sprawl like the way the United States did, right? And the United States could embrace urban sprawl. I talk about it in the 1930s, could make it official policy in the 1930s, beginning 1920s, then made it official policy in the 1930s because domestically there were large amounts of oil in the United States. And so urban sprawl was, from a certain point of view, I guess, a rational, reasonable strategy to combat the Depression because A, the United States led the world in terms of automobile production. Already by the 1920s, the United States produced upwards of 80-85% of the world's automobiles. And again, even this could be attained, again, because of the large amounts of oil domestically. So countries of Western Central Europe, essentially, for all intents and purposes, have no oil. Right. Japan has no oil. So Japan didn't even have an automobile industry until the 1960s. And it's important to note that Japan's automobile industry only came into being because it could feed into the American consumer market. So what happens in a country like France, to fast forward it to today, France, again, in an effort to insulate itself from the world oil market, again, one it has limited control over, set for itself a path of nuclear power. So limiting automobile use, rationally organizing its urban zones around walking, around subways, around trolleys, and also part of this strategy is a nuclearization of its energy infrastructure. So that's what France did in the aftermath of the 1973 oil shock, where the Saudis instituted an embargo of oil and boycotting selling oil to certain countries. France made the decision they're going to switch to nuclear power. And so again, in order to maintain the momentum of its nuclear energy program, in order presumably to minimize automobile dependency, again, France has blocked any kind of move towards hydrofracking in that country.
So we have obviously the administration in the White House, but in your book and in your lectures, you talk about the fact that, you know, these environmental groups, right, like the Sierra Club or National Wildlife Foundation, whatever, that they cannot be trusted to stand up for the environmental movement, in the sense that they don't mention urban sprawl, they avoid it, and they sort of just go with the flow and whatever the federal government seems to want to go. So why is that? Why can we not rely on these?
Well, I mean, yes, I talk about this in my literature, how the mainstream environmental groups, Sierra Club, you mentioned Sierra Club, U.S. PIRG, Union of Concerned Scientists, these groups focus primarily on organizational maintenance. In other words, just simply maintaining their organizations, making payroll. And the unfortunate reality for these groups is that their best source of raising dollars is from the well-to-do. Right? And so the well-to-do, which have these large homes, which have, SUVs and whatnot, they don't want to feel like these groups are critiquing them, right? They don't want to feel like, they're giving money to Sierra Club and then Sierra Club's turning around and critiquing their SUVs. So what happens is Sierra Club takes the path of least resistance. It talks about wind and solar as the panacea for dealing with climate change. It does prop up the myth that the Democratic Party wants to do something about climate change, and again, the record says something completely different. So, but again, these groups, yes, they can be viewed as not very committed to the environment and much more committed to simply meeting their payrolls, right? To getting their paychecks. Again, that is a reasonable conclusion in terms of looking at these groups, and I would urge you to look at my books more closely for any further evidence and treatment of this this thesis.
So the three of us are journalists. Do we think that the media, those mainstream or alternative media sites, are they being implicit in this whole situation? We don't really hear about the issues with urban sprawl on the news. Is that for a reason, or are they they don't think people will care, or why don't we hear on the news?
All right, the game's over now. If you guys want.
Oh, shut up. Look at the sign on the door, dude. Okay. Anyway.
So let's we can
cut
get back to our
break.
last question, since we can edit it together.
Yeah. So basically,
So wait, let's take a little bit of a pause, and then at the end we can record some nat sound to cover the cut, and then we'll start from the beginning of your question again.
Okay. So, as a journalist, I'm inclined to ask, is the media implicit in this situation? Why do we only hear about environmental problems when there are protesters being sprayed with fire hoses? And, why is the topic of climate change not urgent seeming in the mainstream and alternative media sites?
And something interesting you mentioned too, Portia, was that there's breaks in pipelines all over the U.S., but only a few become mainstream. So is the media to blame in terms of educating the American public on what needs to be educated on?
Well, I mean, I would say absolutely. So, it used to be that I was doing graduate study in the 90s, and I was looking at environmental politics in the 90s, and the media, the literature would say, well, the environment is a difficult issue to cover by the environment. The environment's a difficult issue to cover by the media because, right, the media is driven by individual events, right? And especially talking about television media, right, they need visuals, right? So it's difficult to, portray visually the extinction of a species, right? Well, again, in 2017, this is no longer the case. There are tremendously powerful visuals. You look at Hal Wanless here in the university in the Department of Geology. He has some great video, I say great, but of the Greenland ice melting, of all this massive amount of ice which is going into the sea during the summer. We hear in earlier this year, there was a piece of ice that broke off from the Antarctic that I believe was the size of the state of Delaware. Al Gore in Inconvenient Truth shows us some video of this collapse of this ice sheet in the Antarctic. That ice sheet had been intact, as far as scientists can tell, for 30,000 years. It disappeared within 30 days. So there's lots of great visual evidence out there of, again, how the climate is basically falling apart. Right, but the media it doesn't want to show us this, as far as I can tell, right? And so, they don't give the same kind of urgency to the question of the environment as they will some other issues that they want to highlight. Let's say, Russia's interference in our political system. There's a drumbeat there, and there's lots and lots of stories, and the public is made very well aware. Even though I would have to submit, and I know this is the subject matter, even though there's like no evidence, but they'll keep repeating the fact that Russia has again interfered in our elections. And so, I mean, one of the interesting things that I'm turning over to you guys now, but I remember reading an article in the New York Times, I want to say within the last couple of years, where the article said quite explicitly, America could reform its urban sprawl, but that's not likely. And it just drops it at that. I'm like, well, I mean, that really should be the focus of a lot of discussion. Why is it that we're not reforming our urban zones? Because that is the question of the day in my mind.
So I find out all that whole talk about urban sprawl very curious and how it's affecting our global climate. But I want to talk a little bit about here in Miami, since we are one of those places that would be the forefront of being impacted by a changing climate and the effects of it. Do you know what local officials here are doing to prepare, and is there anything that the university needs to be doing or is doing?
Well, I mean, the fact is that the state of Florida, and South Florida in particular, is one of the most, if not the most, vulnerable regions in the world to sea level rise. And it's very sad and unfortunate that the state government has basically buried its head in the sand on this question, right? And in some regards, it may even be, again, pro-global warming in the way that it doesn't want to talk about the issue, doesn't want to really raise it. What we see locally, and again, I do think that this is really a cop-out, what we see locally is the discussion of adaptation, right? So let's do things to adapt to sea level rise. And I say this is a cop-out because there is no adaptation. They're really, I mean, to the extent that politically leads anywhere around the world talk about adaptation, I would submit, and this, I'm being a bit hyperbolous here, but nevertheless, I would submit that to lie. Because the way that we are destabilizing the biosphere, right, again, the changes that are going to be made, we can anticipate are going to be very catastrophic. And there is really no adaptation to this, right? So in other words, just think about the question of rainfall. Right, like we know now, okay, a certain amount of rain in any given year falls in Iowa, okay, and so we could develop our food infrastructure based on that assumption. Well, what if, now all of a sudden, what if the rain falls very randomly? Some years it falls in Arizona, some years it falls in Iowa, some years it falls out in the Gulf of Mexico. There's no adaptation to that. There's no place you could put farms then. Right, just by way of example. Again, how can a place like New York or South Florida adapt itself to 20 feet of sea level rise? Guess what? It cannot. So, again, the discussion of adaptation, in my mind, is just one of those ways to deflect and obscure the fact is that this year is a record year in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. That should be a New York Times front page article, not simply for a day, not simply for a week, but that should be for a month. And they should do not only headlines, but story after story after story about how this year, 2017, is a record year in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, instead, what the New York Times will say, California is doing something. New York is doing something, right? In other words, they'll make it seem like things are getting better or things are happening, but they're getting worse. They're getting worse. So yes, in this way, I do find the corporate media, the mainstream media, to be very, very complicit in this process of keeping people really blind and ignorant to the very real catastrophes that face us. And I just want to make this one last point, which is that the New York Times, again, now this is back page, the New York Times said in the next 20 to 30 years, we can expect broad-based famine as a result of global warming. So here the New York Times is admitting this, not in a headline, but burying it in one of its myriad stories about the environment. Again, why is that not a headline? Why are the news shows not talking about this consistently? How over the next 10 to 20 years, and that's even optimistic, that is not going to happen sooner, we can expect broad-based famine.
So what would you say to somebody like myself that hears these sort of things and doesn't want to have children. I mean, I don't want to bring people into a world of famine and sea level rise, and also to contribute to overpopulation. Like, what do we say then, you know?
Well, I mean, look, in the end, the only answers in my mind are global, right? You know, we have a global biosphere, we have a global economy, right? The nation state is an irrational entity in this context, right? So here you have Donald Trump going to the UN saying, oh, you know, I'm going to lead the world for America first. Okay. Well, in a world of global warming, that is the most profoundly irrational, backwards, and yes, I will say it, stupid statement one can say, right? Because there is no such thing as America. There is no such thing as America when it comes to the biosphere. There really is no such thing. There's no such thing as America in the context of a global economy. I mean, the idea of America first, that makes no sense. There is no American economy. The American economy is interlinked in a broader global network of economic activity, right? So, you know, this idea of America first, I mean, it's backwards, it's a fantasy, it's fundamentally dangerous, and yes, it has some racist overtones. So, I mean, in a sense, what I would say is we need a global strategy. Not only with regard to global warming, but the global economy. We need to deal with living standards, working standards at the global scale. Yes, we need to think about regulating our global population at the global scale, right? Yes, we have 7 billion people right now. As it stands, that's too many people. It is too many people. And there are some very credible demographic models that suggest that the human population will grow to 50 billion by the end of this century. Now, I say it's gonna, I say these models say that. Of course, the planet can't sustain that. So what's gonna happen is it's gonna be a collapse, right? So either we regulate our population in a rational, reasonable way, right? I've heard that the ideal number for humans in a modern context is 2 billion. Either we regulate it ourselves, or nature's gonna do it for us, and that's gonna be catastrophic. Right? So again, we need a global strategy to deal with climate change, to deal with the effects of climate change, to deal with questions of biodiversity, and to deal with a whole host of political, social, and economic questions.
Well, how do you convince an administration like Trump's that global warming is an issue, especially given that they want to reduce the size of national monuments to build more oil rigs? Like, how do you go about even putting that idea?
And have we seen environmental groups start to fight harder because of the Trump administration?
And have civilizations perished because of like environmental
concerns? No, that's no doubt. The civilizations have perished. I mean, there's no other way to say, but of course the Trump administration needs to be impeached. The Trump administration needs to be thrown out. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
Say that 3 more times.
No, it does. It needs to be thrown out for its global warming strategy, or lack thereof, or its pro-global warming attitude, right. For its outright racism, it needs to be impeached. For this tax policy it just instituted, it needs to be impeached, right? We need a very substantial change of direction in terms of American government. Now, in terms of environmental groups, I mean, my critique would be that what mainstream environmental groups, at least this is what they've done historically, we're going to fight harder by pushing for the Democrats. Again, the Democrats have done nothing. Again, it's important to stress that President Obama had 2 different chances to negotiate a climate change treaty. In both instances, both those cases failed, right? So we do not have a climate change treaty. We do not have a plan to deal with climate change emissions, significant part because of the Obama administration, right? So the Democrats, again, they didn't do anything. If anything, they've paved the way for the Trump administration, right? So in this way, right, American political economic elite can celebrate the hydrofracking revolution. They can indulge in the hydrofracking revolution, right? And then in that way, global warming doesn't exist, right? Because what they want to think about, they just want to think about the fact that American urban sprawl has become stabilized due to the hydrofracking revolution, and that's all they want to think about. It's been stabilized today. It doesn't matter that urban sprawl is being destabilized by global warming, right? They just want to celebrate and enjoy the fact that the hydrofracking revolution has stabilized urban sprawl today. And in that context, they just say, you know what? Global warming doesn't exist. It's just convenient for them to say that. Again, talking about Trump. But again, the Democrats are part and parcel of this. So, I mean, what happens with these mainstream environmental groups is things like the Trump administration, they view them, and again, I draw this from history, they view them as simply fundraising mechanisms. Right? Because people will say, we're worried about the Donald Trump administration, its environmental record. Let's give to Greenpeace. Let's give to Union of Concerned Scientists. Which again, are not raising urban sprawl, right? They're not talking about how American foreign policy, in terms of dominating the world oil system, works to bring oil onto the world market, again, deepening global dependency on oil and other fossil fuels.
Okay, so I want to try to end on some sort of hopeful maybe note here. So would you say that then if we can't get across to environmental groups or the government that we need to focus on, grassroots and civil society but how can that make a change if we can't change legislation, if we can't make, real laws and real action?
It's always been the people that bring about change. Make no mistake about it, in terms of the American Revolution, in terms of the Civil War, in terms of defeating the Nazi scourge. It's always been the people. And what you're doing today in terms of this radio show and what other people are doing in terms of going out there and reaching the public and trying to educate them, that's how change will come about, and it will come about. The question is, what's the strategy going to be? And in that way, people do need to be educated. And again, shows like this do it. Again, dealing with urban sprawl, right? Dealing with the fact that the United States government is heading the world towards deepening our fossil fuel dependency, that the American government is leading the world towards climate catastrophe. This is what we need to do to educate the public on. And, I say it's darkest before the dawn. I know right now, talking right now, things seem very pessimistic, but I do have a faith in the public. And I do think that the promise of, global governance, types of global government, I think humanity will right the ship of state. And they need to, and again, shows like this educate them on how the ship of state is leading us towards catastrophe. But we can right the ship of state, and I fully believe that the broader public will do this. And again, shows like this play a key role in that.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Gonzalez. You are a very woke man, very intelligent. His book, American Empire and the Canadian Oil Sands, can be found in most bookstores.
And Amazon.
Feel free to get it for Christmas. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you guys. You guys are doing great work, so thank you.
Thank you. And actually, it is our last show of the semester, and Portia will be leaving us this semester to go to LA. Mm-hmm. So a big shout out to Portia for making this show happen.
And
So thank you guys so much for tuning in. My name is Paul Schulz.
I'm Portia Baudisch.
And I'm Joshi.
And this is Talking Taboo. We will resume in the year 2018. Thank you guys so much for tuning in.